So then I suppose that leads on quite nicely to when might it be most useful to utilize talk and when might it best be avoided?
I think that partner talk is such a versatile pedagogical tool that it's hard to narrow it down to just a few things. But I think it's worth pointing out a couple of things where I think it's particularly valuable. I think whenever we're asking children to reason about something or give their opinion on something, questions that begin with, say, why or how, or why do you think X, Y, and Z, I think that's a really excellent time to use partner talk. Again, this is relying on certain relationships and certain routines and behaviors being in place. But I think that's a particularly valuable time. Also, where children are in some way discussing alternatives. So what I mean by that is, let's say we're in mathematics and children have been adding 87 add 46, and we've seen around the room that there are different methods. Getting children then to say, okay, so how did you do that? Or did you find a way that was different to your partner? And if you had the same method as your partner, can you find another method that someone else in the room might have done? I think as soon as you've got alternatives that are equally valid, that's a great time for partner talk, because firstly, it's just really good to talk about that kind of reasoning, but also because it validates the idea that there are different ways of thinking about things, which is, something that we always want to encourage in the classroom. When we're trying to retrieve something that's a little more complex, something that isn't just a, one word or one sentence answer, I think it's really valuable as a tool at that point. I've mentioned it already, but the idea of, retelling a story using text maps or this sort of thing, you can do that on a whiteboard and you can assess, I guess, to some extent that way if you want to. But beyond assessment, just the idea of getting children to remember something and to think a bit more deeply about something, partner talk could be great for more complex retrieval, I think.
Cognitive psychologists might call that elaboration. I know that in the Learning Scientist book, Understanding How We Learn, they talk about elaboration as something that can be really beneficial in terms of committing things to long-term memory. And so I think I'm definitely with you on that one. My final point would be in terms of, when it's most useful. We've often talked on this podcast about when we want to guide people thinking and we want them to think really hard about something. And it's knowing what it is we want them to think about and then setting up these really carefully structured situations in which we can guide, because, we're not going inside their heads, not within the next 20, 30 years anyway. So we have to find other means. And I think this kind of situation, where we have them elaborating in a structured way with a partner, I think that allows us to focus their thinking in a particularly productive and beneficial way.
I think the only thing I would add, and again, sort of a final point here from me, it would be that consider when in the learning sequence you want to open it up to this. I think, are you going to be launching into a lot of this right at the beginning when it's in its infancy? I'd argue that potentially that might not be the best idea, but maybe leaving it a little bit further down the line and looking at the ratio of how much of those why and how questions, like Chris said, you ask, compared to when that's happening in the sequence of learning. I think that's a really important point. And again, for early career teachers, something that is more complex. For teachers who are more experienced, have more of a handle on it, because well, I'm not going to submerge them in that, because they're going to, they'll drown with that information. They won't be able to process and have those conversations. So it's knowing when to deploy. It's like we say on all episodes to that, it's that armory, it's that toolkit. It's like when to deploy the right strategies at the right times. And I think with oracy as well, I think that needs a consideration. It's not to say you don't have any talk opportunity. I guess it's the type of talk opportunity you have and when is really, really important to consider.
Linked to that, I think generally speaking, I don't tend to ask children to do a bit of partner talk at the point where I think they're confused. And I've seen this in classrooms. There's a tendency to say, well, hopefully it will come out in the wash. They'll have a little chat, and the one in the pair who has understood this will support the child next to them. And then for me, when children are confused about something, they've made it clear that they're holding a misconception, I want to kind of, for want of a better phrase, take charge of the discussion for a little while. I might bring it back round to partner talk, but that will ideally be at a point where I think, yeah, children are beginning to grasp this, or they're gaining a bit of confidence with this. Personally, I'm a big fan of, when it comes to children doing a decent chunk of independent work, I prefer to have something close to silence in the classroom. I find that if you have that bit of chat effectively that's going on in the background, even if it is seemingly productive and seemingly relating to what you're talking about, particularly in a subject like mathematics, it's quite easy for children to end up hiding that they haven't understood something. By being able to have a chat with someone across the table and say, what did you get for question 3? Oh, you got that. And then writing it in their book, which can make life significantly more difficult when it comes to us working out which children have really understood. So I think I'm quite the fan of silent independent work, or a chunk of silent independent work. How much of that there is obviously dependent on the age range that you're teaching. In some cases, there might be none of that if we're talking right down at the bottom of the school. But as you move through the school, the importance, I think, of that silent work increases. Sounds like an obvious thing to say, but I don't think partner talk is a particularly valuable thing to do if we're dealing with formative assessment. Again, sounds obvious, but I've been into classrooms, and I'm sure at some point I've done this myself, where effectively I've said, okay, have a think about this, talk about it with your partner, and then I've asked for some kind of feedback based on that, and then the lesson has progressed because I've thought, oh, okay, yeah, it seems like they've understood this. Well, possibly just half the class have understood this, and there's half the class sitting there a bit lost by it, but their partner knows it, so they've kind of, they've got away with it to a certain extent. Effectively, things like think, pair, share, great for getting children to think about a bit of learning. But as soon as you're thinking, oh, okay, I want to assess what children have understood, it has to be something that is independent of that, something that doesn't have a little buttressing element of partner talk to begin with, because obviously then you're not really finding out what the children know, you're just finding out what they or their partner know, which is significantly less useful.